G'day and welcome back. This is the next video in my series on chess stats, which is where I do a more statistical analysis of some of the data behind chess rather than the game of chess itself. Now, this video probably makes more sense if you watched my previous video on chess stats, where I've been doing some sort of in-depth analysis of the quality of play in the endgames. In the previous video, I looked at the percentage of errors made by different players ranked by rating and came to the fairly logical conclusion that the super GMs and so on, they play the endgames to a much higher standard than us mere mortals. Now, I did that categorization based on a few different endgames with not too many pieces on them, king versus pawn, king and pawn, and so on. And I've made the logical extension here in two ways. I've expanded the set of endgames a little bit more, and relying on a six-piece table base. And secondly, I've said, well, I mean, if I did for rating classes, well, of course, for the top players who played many games, we can actually use this as sort of analysis or a metric of how good they are at playing endgames. So the general way I've done the analysis is, just let me bring up this slide here, and we'll go into a little more detail later, is that games database, and use Caser-based this time, use something similar. I think it's about 4 million games in the database, and then I come up with a set of endgame filters, as I say, the type of endgame they are, and then when I'm going through those list of games, I go to that position in the game where that particular endgame, king and pawn versus king, first begins, and then I use step through the game using Python chess and look for the errors according to the table base. And if a person is winning a game and it drops to a draw on a move, well, that's a win to a draw, which is an error. And if a guy's drawing a game and is then losing after a move on that gets marked as a draw to a loss type of error. Okay, now what I'm trying to get at here, of course, I think we all recognize Carlsen is definitely a goat of sorts in the end games, and just to get a bit of a perspective of who else can rank up in his high pantheon. And I mean, I just looked at some various lists on the internet and also have my own sort of perspective on this, and we'll see how it goes. But at first glance, you'd be thinking of the older era. You'd be talking Casablanca and Lasker and Rubinstein, pretty famous for strong endgame play and fighting play in the endgame. You move on a bit around and after World War II, maybe Smyslov, Botvinnik, and I think Floor is quite highly regarded. And then a little bit later on, Karpov, of course, and Ulf Andersson, both very highly ranked. And more recently, we've, of course, got Carlsen. But I think there's a whole set of players here, Caruanas, Nakamura's, Giris, and so on, who are all regarded as being very excellent endgame players. But strangely enough, it's another player who pops to the top when I do my analysis, which I found quite curious. Okay, so just going through that process I've just described there, let's have a quick look at a few things. Let me go to my capture screen. The first thing I said is I've got the database and then I want to go and find all the games. And this is basically the model I've used. I mean, I've got a six-piece table base that I'm using here. I could have just used the file name of the six-piece table bases and used them all up. But what I've done here is you can see that king and a bishop versus king and rook. And then basically I then go later on and add on as many pawns as possible so that you have 6 pieces or less. You've got to do that both ways. King and a knight versus a king and a rook, king and a rook and a knight versus king and a rook, and a king and a rook and a bishop versus a king and a rook. And then on top of that, you do king and knight versus king and knight, and king and bishop versus king and bishop, and king and rook versus king and rook, right? So it's a bit confusing here, but just to show you, I've got another section where that's sort of loaded up. There's all the sort of the one piece, 0 and 1 piece on top of the king, which I'm also doing. That's called the base. That gives you a very nice set of all the sensible endgames, 6 pieces and less, which you are looking at. And then, as I think I explained in this previous video, then what I do is I obviously filter for those games, go to the position in the game where that particular ending particularly starts, and start stepping through the game. It either was supposed to be a win, ends up a win, was supposed to be a loss, ends up a loss, was supposed to be a draw, ends up a draw, and the player on the move can change the result. Now, one interesting thing here is you often think of players like Carlsen, they're sort of, they have this psychic power to make other people make errors or whatever, right? Haven't really tried to capture that at all. But what I've done is I have actually stepped out of the analysis when the first error is made. So I might, that's something I might refine in later things. This is like a lot of food for thought. There's no real right or wrong answers, but I just thought this was an interesting way of doing the analysis. Okay, so that's what I did. Took a lot of time to get all the data together. And then, so what do we get out of that? At the end of the day, we get a set of charts. We'll have a look at this game later. It's quite curious, this game. So Python over here, and you'll see the charts we've come up with. Okay, so in the database, the total number of games played I play in this database Sokolov, he was around for a long time, Korchnoi, Petrosian, Gurevich, Ivanchuk, Shirov, Nakamura, Timon, Karpov, Portish, blah, blah, blah. Carlson's a bit lower down there because he hasn't been around for as long as those guys to some degree. Now, one other big problem I have is my database does not distinguish between Blitz, Bullet, Rapid, and classical length. I tried to strip out before this all the Bullet and Blitz ones. I don't think I got rid of them all, and maybe get rid of some of the online ones as well. I would like to have done. So that's something which I'm going to refine a little bit better, because you can see that really does impact, as we said later on, the accuracy of Carlson and Nakamura is definitely lower, because I've included a lot of these faster time control games, and I think that's sort of a well-established fact of chess play. So, usual suspects there in terms of people playing the games. Okay, let's go on the next one. I tried to actually look at the number of moves as a metric, longer end games, more chance of losses and all that sort of stuff, but I didn't really use that, so I'll just flip on that one. Right, total end game by player and database. Now we're getting the interesting stuff. Nakamura and Carlson definitely have the most end games. I think it really reflects the play. They play more games and they play more Blitz and online games. And a lot of the usual suspects here, Roni and Geary. As we go through, I've highlighted a few player names here, which we'll see why as time continues. But these are players who have played a lot of end games. I'm not necessarily saying they are playing them well, poorly. And then percentage end games by player and data. This is where we're trying to get a bit more closer to what we actually think, that if a player actually ends up playing end games a lot in their games, well, then they're more likely to be a good end game player. Now, Carlson very high up, Nakamura very high up. Interesting, Erigaisi, Faruja, Abdusattorov, etc., also very high up. Now, that might be something with the fact that, like Faruja, for instance, well known as a very fighting player, so you probably end up in the end game no matter what. Interesting games on that list, so that's sort of getting a bit close to where we want to get to. Now, there's most errors by player in the database, just counting up the number of errors. Obviously, Carlson and Nakamura played most games, so they probably have most errors. No surprises there. Grishchuk doesn't seem to be very well known as a great end player, but he's a great player, and he's always a great end game player, but he's also made quite a few errors in the end game. And now we're sort of getting on to the sort of analysis I'm talking about. Given that a player like Nakamura and Carlson got into an end game, how many errors do they make as a percentage of games? Now, this is where I get into an issue of there are a few players who don't really have enough games to get scored effectively. With Gukesh, he's quite high up in the error rate. I mean, a young player, and he's obviously made some errors. And in fact, I went just to double check. He's made 3 errors according to my little database, and they're all rapid play games. So once again, perhaps an unfair reflection on his skill level, which is obviously very damn high. So just looking at what we do have, that top bunch of players, which I filter most of them out later, is they are people who have not made a single error according to my metric in the database. Now, some of them are, perhaps no surprise, Nimzowitsch, I think, was regarded as good endgame players. Floor is there. And there's Anderson, so he definitely a very good endgame player. But I think Anderson is like about 86 games. So what I did is I then filtered this by he got at least played 80 games, and none, of course, none's written many endgame books. And then Boleslavsky, and so just click on the next page because I've just filtered this to get rid of those guys with few games on the list. And yeah, this is we're getting to what we want, right? So what you will notice, which I was talking about, is Ponomariov. He's made 1 error in about 200 games, which is absolutely unbelievable, right? You see, occasionally gets mentioned as a great endgame player, but that's just outstanding play. I mean, he's as a top player, he's looked down a little bit, even though he did win the FIDE World Championship, so it can't be bad. There's Karras, one of my favorites, right? He made 1 error in about 90 games, so obviously also a very good player. And Nikolic also strong, Belevsky, Timon, Geller, Karpov, right? Nobody can play with these names, Karyakin, and then you've got Mamedyarov. I highlighted Mamedyarov because he's not a guy I wouldn't expect to be there, more of like a Krishtuk type player, but actually he's very good in the end game as well, has a lot of end games and makes very few mistakes. Adams, another player, I think is pretty highly regarded as an end game player. And then finally we're getting Nakamura and Carlson. As I say, I think their results are contaminated by the fact that they play a lot more Blitz, Bullet, online, and so on, which I haven't been able to filter out all of in my database. And you go down a bit lower, you got Petrosian and Leko. I mean, they're good players as well. So this error rate of this 3%, nothing to be embarrassed about at all. These are all super strong players. So next step is now what can we do? We can match the errors in endgames versus how many endgames you have. Now, this is quite a highly filtered one, and you can see why Ponomariov actually looks like the GOAT on this score, right? You see Nakamura and Carlson, many endgames, 12% of their games end up in endgames, and then we've got a sort of a profile there that some players who play less endgames are more accurate, but then, that's obviously sort of a trade-off there. and a few of the other people I've highlighted: Mamedyarov, Adams, Karpov, very high up, along with Timon, also a strong endgame player. Yeah, you can't sort of complain about any of these guys. And then to make these guys look a little bit better, you then put the full map down, and you can see why this. I think this current generation is actually really outstanding. Carlson, Nakamura, Giri, Caruana, Kariakin, Wei. Right, it's sort of a pocket. If you have a look at that sort of pocket of players, they're all over here. They play a lot of end games, and they play them very, very accurately. And there's Ding. I know that the earlier players played less because I think it was, more longer time controls, and therefore they were also had greater accuracy because of the longer time control. A few of the other people, Smyslov, we mentioned before. Fortunately, I've got his book, Endgame book. I was very saddened when I saw Spielman's name up here because I've got a couple of his Endgame books and I'm really enjoying them. Looks like he was quite error prone in the Endgame himself. So that was this chart here is what I want you to take away. Get a sense of who played the most Endgames and who's best in those Endgames. And a lot of these players could be regarded as GOATs. Now, what I said earlier, going to look at now, is Ponomariov. I only found one error in 190 something games, and this was his error. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes looking at this game because it's a very interesting game. White, which is Ponomariov, should be able to hold, but it's very easy to go wrong. It's very much a case of can black either take the pawn on a6, exchange off the bishop, and this pawn run through, or sometimes can the rook take the bishop on b7, same outcome with the pawn making it through, and always relies on the white king being forced as far away as possible. So let's have a look at this game. Okay, this is the position where I want to start from. Now you can see that I'm highlighting two moves there, king to f4 or king to f6. Now the drawing move here is king to f4, which is not what Ponomariov played. Just on reflection here, you see this game actually did end up a draw, even though Ponomariov made a losing mistake. His opponent, Nihua, then made a corresponding mistake and it ended up being a draw, which is something I've got to work out how to sort of deal with that in future iterations of this process of looking at how good players are in the end game. So let's have a look at king f4 first, which is the drawing line. Now, basically, we just sort of go forward a few moves. That allows the black king to move up to the bishop, possibly create some threats. But basically, white just holds station. And because white is able to sort of be within a certain zone, so white's close enough to deal with any threats if black should swap his rook off for the bishop and pawn on either a6 or b7. Now let's have a look at the continuation as played. Funny there, I don't know why. So in this position, he played king to f6, which looks natural, but actually what happens in this position? It's all about the white king being able to get back to there in some instances. So you're moving away from that route, and you're more likely to be shouldered away from that route if you're that far forwards. And also your king gets quite restricted in this little box here, and there's a combination of those factors which means that the position becomes lost. So let's have a look at the continuation. Black does the same thing, moves his king up, and white can just hold station. I mean, there's a couple of continuations. Let's do bishop g2 is regarded as a better line. So let's go through the game continuation very quickly. 2 moves and we're back to being drawn. So let's go over a computer line here. White holds station by just holding his bishop up under that diagonal. And then basically rook b5, bishop f3. Black is just maneuvering, trying to basically squeeze white's king away. I mean, the thing is that you get to a position with, we'll see in a minute, with the black rook gets there. White doesn't have a lot of flexibility with the pieces, and therefore his king gets pushed back regardless of what he does. So you just look at this position. Actually, in this case, the rook's gone to the a5 square and can gain a tempo now. So you've got the king miles away, gain a tempo on the bishop because the bishop there was definite lack of space for the bishop and the king in this position. And then now you've got enough tempo to win in this position because, in fact, the computer doesn't even want to take the rook. But let's say if the computer did take the rook, let's see what happens. Obviously, the king's scampering over there, but you've shouldered the king out of the way, and it's going to be a win for black. So I think this end game, I've seen a couple of other end games. I think one of Gukesh's losses was in a very similar position. This is a very interesting end game. Rook and pawn versus bishop and pawn, and then there's a lot of subtleties which you can see in terms of where the defending king has to move. Okay, so hope that makes sense. I mean, this is just like a food for thought, a bit of a teaser. I've got a few ideas on extending the analysis. Obviously, going to 7-piece table bases. I've got to adjust for time controls, including errors all the way through to the end of the game, not sort of jumping out on the first error. And then part of the other issue here is that even if I go to 7-piece table bases, it's not really reflecting, what we kind of realize what Carlson's skill is, strategic thinking and pressuring from an endgame with a couple of pieces on either side, and really posing difficult questions to the defender and basically wearing a lot of people down. You don't quite see this. This is more just pure technical, very tactical side of it, but still a bit of strategy. So, and of course, I've got a big list of games now, including errors by these great players, including the Carlson one. His error against the Rhine in 2006, a very instructive look Endgame. So that might show up on the other playlist I've got a little bit later. I hope you enjoyed that and sort of enjoyed the conclusions. And we've got a new sort of go to Endgames Ponomariov. Thank you very much for watching.